In this video, I'm going to make some modifications to the CSS that I have applied to my HTML document. In a previous video, I used this CSS styling here to style multiple elements. As you can see, my text is red, so I want to modify that and style things properly to make it look a bit more decent. So what I'm going to do in this video, I'm going to style the H1 element, which is this here, which is this title. I'm going to style that separately. I'm going to let the color go back to the standard color, which is black, but I'm going to make the font size bigger, and I'm going to align the text to the center. I'm also going to style both the paragraph and the list item. So I'm going to apply some extra properties. I'm going to change the font size, the line height, and the letter spacing. So let me head over to my CSS. So I just click on the CSS file here, and this is where I can make the changes. So the first thing I want to do here is get rid of the list, the H1 item, because I want to give that a different style. I will just leave the paragraph and the list item, and I'm going to change some properties. I'm going to change the font size, set that to, I'm going to give it a value of 17 pixels. Pixels is a unit of measurement when how you measure the sizes. So that's going to be set to 17 pixels. And then I'll put a semicolon to terminate that. And then I'll add another style. This time I want to do the line height. That is the height between, you can see this text here and this text. So that's known as the line height. I'm going to change that as well. So I'll do line. This is another property you can see is giving me suggestion here. So I just click on that. That's the property. I'm going to make it 2, give it a value of 2, and do a semicolon. Next, I'm going to do the letter spacing. Basically, is a space between the letters. I'm going to type in letter. You can see it's giving me suggestion. I just use that, and I'm going to make that 1 pixel. Okay, you can see the letters, you can see this, you can see the line height, and the spacing is already effective here. All right, you can see the changes are already reflected on the page. So that's my list item and my paragraph. Next, I want to style my H1 element. So H1 is going to be the selector. I'll do my curly braces. In between the curly braces, I'm going to change the font size property. So I want to change the size of the font, and I want this, I'll give it a big size. I'll make this one 65 pixels. I'm just being adventurous here. You can see how big it is. Next, I want to align the text to the center. So the property is text align property, and the value I'm giving it is center. That's it. And I will save that and refresh. So you can see here the text has been aligned. You can see it's moved away from the other content towards the center. So if I expand the page, you can see the text being aligned to the center. Okay, so that's basically how you change. You can make modifications to any CSS at any time just by going to the CSS file and making the relevant changes. And you can also add more CSS rules to your style sheet. So that's basically it for this video on modifying your CSS. Thank you for watching. I will be introducing you to some basic CSS selectors. There are different types of selectors in CSS. We've already used the element selector and also the grouping selector. But I'll just run through these basic selectors on the screen. So we've got the element selector. Basically, it refers to the actual HTML element. For example, the paragraph element, which is the P element, that is known as an element selector. The heading or H1, that could be another element selector. So there are different element selectors. You specify an element selector based on the HTML element you're trying to apply the CSS styling to. Next, we've got the ID selector. The ID selector basically is used to select an element on the page that has a specific ID. The IDs are unique. You can only have one element per ID on a page. You can't use the same ID for multiple elements on the page. So ID selectors are unique, and they are represented in the CSS by the hash symbol. So anywhere you see the hash symbol on the CSS sheet, you know that's referring to an ID selector. Next, we've got a class selector, which is similar to the ID, but the key difference with the class selector is that you can reference it multiple times. You can declare a class selector on a page and use it on several elements on that page, in comparison to ID selector that is unique per element on a page. And you characterize the class selector with a period or a dot. So anywhere you see a period on a dot in a CSS style sheet, you know you are referring to a class. Next, we've got the grouping selector. We've used the grouping selectors so far in this course, where we selected multiple elements and grouped them together to apply styling, just like I've done here. So that is known as a grouping selector. There's also another selector here, which is represented by the asterisk symbol. What that does is used to select all the elements. If you want to apply a certain style to all the elements on the page, then you can use the asterisk selector, and that will apply the styling to all the elements in the page. So this is my HTML. If I click on my CSS file here, we can see an example of the grouping selector here. This here is a grouping selector where I'm grouping more than one element and applying the styling to those elements. Here, this is an element selector. I've just used one element. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to define an ID selector and also a class selector so that I can show you how they are used. So I'm going to go over to my HTML document. So I'll click on the index.html, and I'm going to, the way you have to add an ID. You do that using the ID attribute. The ID is an attribute. So what you do here, for example, I want to make this paragraph here, I want to make the content in italics. So what I do, which is this content here, inside the paragraph tag is where I need to specify. I do a space and just type in ID, which is the ID attribute. You give it a name, a value. So you surround the value in quotes. So I'm going to call this quote. All right. So I've given this paragraph an ID now, which is unique. I cannot, now that I've used this here, I can't use the same ID anywhere else in the page because it is unique to the page. So now I go into my CSS, and the way to use the ID, you indicate a pound sign, which indicates that you are referencing an ID, followed by the name of the ID. I called mine quote. Let me go back just to make sure. If you don't get it right, it will not apply the CSS. So that's my ID called quote, And next I do the curly braces, opening and closing, and all I want to do here is make the font, the style of the font, I want to make it italics, and just end that with a semicolon. You can see it's already reflected. Look at it here. You can see that's already turned italics. So I just click Save All. So this is an example of using an ID attribute, where you use the ID attribute inside the opening element like I've done here. So you can only have one ID per page. So I cannot use this ID called quote anymore on this page on any other element. Next, I want to add a class attribute ID. So I want to this paragraph here called Today's a New Day, which is this one here, and also this here, which is this here. I want to use class selectors to apply CSS to them. So what I'll do inside here, with a class selector you can use it multiple times in a page, while an ID selector you can only use it once. So here I'm going to define a class. You will define it inside the opening elements. So I'm going to type in class as the attribute. I'm going to give a value. I'm going to call this call it para. Okay, and I can use it again here, and I'm going to use it again here. Type in class and give it a value of para. So you can see here I'm using the same class twice, so you can use it any number of times on any element on your page, whereas the ID, this ID is unique, so I can't use this ID called quote anymore on this page. So now that I've defined the class inside the HTML element, I need to go to my CSS and add the styling for that. So it's called para. So I come here to my CSS, and you do a period or a dot followed by the name of the class, and then my curly braces, and I'll separate the curly braces. In between the curly braces I will now indicate the style rules I want to use. So watch out for this paragraph here and this one here. As I begin to type in the style, it should change. I will say font size. I want to change the font size and make that say 25 pixel. Have you noticed it's changing now? Next, I want to change the color. I'll make this a blue. I forgot to separate. There you go. You can see that. So now I've used the class. You can see it has reflected in these two paragraphs. So that's basically how you use a class selector and an ID selector. So always note that the key difference between a class selector and an ID selector is that a class selector can be used multiple times on any element on the page. An ID selector is unique to the element. Here I've got ID called quote. I cannot use this ID quote anywhere else on the page or on any other element. Whereas this class I've got para, I can use it anywhere I want. So that's it for this basic introduction to CSS selectors. Thank you for watching.